Welcome, everybody. Let me just pull up here. So this is the March edition of our Policy Research Talk series, and we were just trying to remember when the first one of these happened, and we placing it around 2012. So this series has been going on for a very long time. These talks give us an opportunity to present work coming out of the research department and share with colleagues in the bank, outside within the department, outside the department. I want to welcome our audience on WebEx today and on the live stream, and of course to our in-person audience who all seem to be sitting towards the back of the room, which is, who are those backbenchers over there? I'm really pleased to introduce two of my colleagues here today, Fernandes and Devaki Ghose, two researchers in the Trade and Integration team of the Development Research Group. Anna is a lead economist whose research focuses on the consequences of openness to trade and FDI for firm-level productivity, innovation, and quality upgrading. Devaki is a research economist who's primarily interested in studying the distributional consequences of trade and infrastructure investments in developing countries. I'm extremely happy today to welcome our discussant, who is Mona Haddad. Mona is the Global Director for Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness in the Equitable Growth Finance and Institutions Practice Groups, that's EFI for those who don't know what EFI stands for, Vice Presidency. She has worked across the World Bank Group, with her previous position being in IFC, where she led the development of the joint World Bank Group country private sector diagnostics. Prior to this, she held roles including as practice manager of the Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice in East Asia, sector manager of the International Trade Department, as well as, before coming to the World Bank, trade advisor to the Minister of Economy and Trade of Lebanon. I'll start by asking Anna and Devaki to talk for no more than 40 minutes, after which we'll hear from Mona for however long you like, about 10 minutes or so, or 5 to 10 minutes. And we'll conclude with a Q&A from the audience. If you have a question on the WebEx, please raise your hand or signal in the chat that you have a question. I'll call on you. And just remember, everybody, we are recording this session. If you're online, please do mute your microphone when you're not speaking. So with that, over to you, Anna and Devaki.
So thank you all very much, those of you who are here and those online for being here. I'll be giving the first part of the talk, and then Devaki will follow. So before I start showing you my slides, I want to remind everyone of a fact, well-known fact, that has happened over the last 30 to 40 years, which has been the tremendous tariff liberalization that countries at all income levels have seen, whether through their own reforms, through negotiations at the GATT and then WTO, or through the signature of more than 200 preferential trade agreements. So tariffs declined substantially, so much so that at some point, trade research actually turned to studying other types of trade costs, such as reductions or problems with transportation or logistics. And in fact, in 2016, concerned that maybe trade policy was getting forgotten, two well-known and very renowned trade economists with links to the World Bank, Penny Goldberg and Nina Pauchnik, wrote a very nice handbook chapter where they reviewed the effects of tariff liberalization on many economic and social outcomes. When they wrote that piece, they really didn't know what was going to come after that. So in the last few years, since Donald Trump was elected and imposed tariffs on China, there's been a series of shocks that have brought trade policy back to the limelight. In particular, the pandemic, but also the Russia-Ukraine war and the growing climate crisis. The evidence on that trend of lower tariffs, substantially lower tariffs over time, can be seen very clearly in this chart, which is taken from work that I've been doing with DEC colleagues Tristan Reed and Lucas Zavala. Here we focus on Latin America, And you can see with the light blue line, a very clear decline in tariffs over the last 20 years. But this has not been happening in isolation. It has been happening together with a strong and substantial increase in the number of non-tariff measures. And my colleague Devaki has been looking at this sort of relationship between tariffs and NTMs for a more global sample and has shown that these NTMs have been replacing tariffs. But for those of you who are not trade enthusiasts or trade nerds, if you want to think about them like this, I need to tell you a little bit about what are these non-tariff measures. So UNCTAD, which is the agency in Geneva that's in charge of collecting data on non-tariff measures, often in collaboration with the World Bank, defines non-tariff measures as measures that are not tariffs, but that affect quantities traded, prices of traded goods, or both. The examples of non-tariff measures that are shown in this slide and that I can describe to you are many. So NTMs are very diverse. They come in all shapes and forms. They can take the form of restrictions on the quantity imported. So it can be a limitation in the number of units of a certain good that you can import, or they can be the requirement of a license to import certain goods, or they may be outright prohibitions of imports of certain goods. And you're going to be hearing a lot throughout our talk about an example from Sri Lanka where a recent policy has introduced a ban, so a complete prohibition in the imports of fertilizers. But NTMs can also be of a different type. They may be pre-shipment inspections that need to happen before the goods come in, or there may be restrictions on the port that the imports come through. For example, in Colombia, there is a restriction in the ports that textile imports can use to enter the country. This is done to prevent smuggling from special economic zones, but it's one more example of a non-tariff measure. And finally, there is a very large group of measures that are of a more regulatory type that are also NTMs. And so this could be something like a testing requirement on whether the oranges that you import still have pesticide residues, or it could be a labeling requirement on the refrigerator that's being imported, indicating the electrical energy usage that it requires. Overall, these NTMs are very complex and very heterogeneous, and you will hear me mention this idea a few times. But despite being complex and heterogeneous, they are the type of policy measures that low and middle income countries have been increasingly imposing. So in this slide, you can see a chart that's produced based on the, we can think of as the hottest database of the moment, the Global Trade Alert. So some of you will have heard of it. In this particular case, it is a version of this database that's been actually produced jointly with the World Bank's EFI, and it's focusing on policy measures that are imposed on essential goods. So here, what you can see is that for low and middle income countries, since 2020, there's been an increase in the number of non-tariff measures imposed, particularly on imports, but also on exports. And you can also see in this slide an increase in the number of domestic subsidies imposed. That's not going to be our focus in the talk today. But in fact, according to UNCTAD's classification of non-tariff measures, domestic subsidies are also a type of non-tariff measures. We're just going to be focusing a little bit on other types of NTMs. And I should also mention that here, these domestic subsidies that we are seeing, they are mostly imposed by the very large emerging markets, China, Turkey, Brazil. So for a lot of the other low and middle income countries, they are not able to resort to these measures because they simply do not have the fiscal capacity to impose them. But at the same time, many countries are imposing NTMs because they face restrictions in terms of how much they can move on their tariffs due to WTO commitments. So countries are indeed increasing the use of NTMs, and then a question is, why are they arming themselves with these measures? They can use these measures to achieve multiple objectives. The measures can have economic objectives. So you can think about a restriction on the quantity of imports of a particular good if the country wants to try to promote the development of the domestic industry producing that good. You know, such measure may be distortive and may not be, you know, efficient in achieving its objective, but that may be the objective for which the measure is imposed. Many countries also impose non-tariff measures to respond to economic crisis. And we're going to see two examples during this first part of the presentation from Sri Lanka and from Argentina, where a main motive for introducing barriers to imports, so non-tariff measures on imports, was to help resolve some balance of payment problems. But many of these measures, particularly those that I described as the regulatory measures, they can have non-economic objectives that are likely to be very legitimate, such as protecting the environment, protecting public health, protecting safety. In the same database that I showed initially, so in this Global Trade Alert database, there is now a question about the motives that countries are invoking to impose different measures. And here I'm showing you a chart that looks at the motives for low and middle income countries to impose measures on imports. And what you can see is that the dominant color is, I think it looks like orange. It is orange. It's a bit different in my screen, but it's the orange. You can see that's the biggest motive for the growing number of import non-tariff measures imposed. And if you look at the label, the orange is strategic competitiveness. So essentially, it's to protect domestic industries. But so those sorts of economic motives are the motives that countries are mostly invoking to impose these measures. But while they may have legitimate motives to be imposed, these import NTMs can be costly, so they can harm countries. So in this figure, we can see, on the left figure, we can see what is the share of trade across different regions of the world that is covered by border NTMs. So border NTMs are, it's a definition that was proposed in a handbook chapter by Ederington and Ruta, but essentially it's most of the measures that I described as quantity controls, but also those pre-shipment inspections, other customs requirements. So it's a bundle of non-tariff measures. And if you look at the left chart, you can see that around the world, about 50% more or less of trade is covered by some of these measures. But the differences across regions are not very large. So most regions are imposing the same amount of NTMs on trade. But the prevalence of, also the presence of these measures doesn't tell us anything about their cost and their restrictiveness. So as I said, non-tariff measures are complex and very different from a tariff rate, which probably most of you know what it is. A tariff rate is simply a proportional tax on the value of imports. So imagine your favorite cheese, French cheese imports coming into the US, they're going to face, let's say, a 10% tariff. That's easy to measure. For NTMs, if you see that the cheese is going to have to go through a testing procedure, we don't know what's the cost and the restrictiveness. So, in fact, the World Bank, in his long history, has been at the forefront of measuring the restrictiveness of non-tariff measures. In fact, not just the World Bank, but actually the World Bank's research department. So back in the very early days of Anne Kruger, later on Will Martin, Kim Anderson, and more recently Hyo-Louis Key, who's still in DEC, along with Marcelo Larreaga and Alessandro Nicita, they developed methodologies to estimate measures of restrictiveness on for these NTMs. So in particular, they construct measures of ad valorem tax equivalents to the NTMs. So basically, their method gives a rate that would be sort of the price increase due to the presence of the non-tariff measures. And that's what's shown on the right chart here. In fact, their methodology is actually the methodology that's used in these UNCTAD reports on trade policy, from which these charts are taken. And what you can see when you look at the right chart, which gives you the restrictiveness of these border non-tariff measures, is that in terms of their cost, they're very different across regions. And in particular, the lower income countries in Africa seem to be those for which these barriers, these measures are more costly. The cost of NTMs and their harm to the countries that impose them can be even more serious if we think about input-output linkages. So even though there is a lot of discussion currently about defragmentation, deglobalization, all of those buzzwords, we are still operating in a world of global value chains. And so there's still a large dependence of many countries on imported inputs for their production. So if you think about the agricultural sector, there's a large share of countries in the world that depend on imported fertilizers for production and exports. Similarly, if you think about manufacturing, there are many countries, many firms that depend, for example, on foreign car parts in order to manufacture vehicles, or that depend on foreign microprocessors to manufacture electronic goods. And the issue then is that if these important critical inputs are subject to NTMs, there can be adverse, harmful consequences for the downstream sectors. And so far, the literature focused very much in understanding what tariffs on imported inputs do, particularly when they are liberalized. So what does the liberalization of imported input tariffs does to manufacturing productivity, to worker wages, to many other downstream outcomes. But there's been so far little work studying the consequences of NTMs on imports in downstream sectors. And so that's what I want to do in the last part of my presentation, which is to give you 3 examples, one from agriculture, which is this Sri Lanka import ban example, and 2 from manufacturing for Argentina and Indonesia, where these studies look at what is the role of NTMs on imported inputs in downstream exports. So in these 3 studies that I'm going to briefly describe to you, what the authors did was to establish a link between the imported inputs and the downstream exports. So they basically created, with slight differences in the definitions, but in all cases they created a measure of exposure of the downstream firms or the downstream products to the use of imported inputs for which there are some non-tariff measures. Once they have constructed these exposure measures, they use them in regressions of the difference in differences type. So they want to try to understand how exports of a given firm, let's say, how exports at the firm level differ for the firms whose products depend more on imported inputs with NTMs versus those that depend less. And so that's the type of approach that's followed in the 3 studies. So starting with the Sri Lanka example, so this example, you're going to hear a lot more about it in the rest of the talk, and this is joint work with Devaki and Eduardo, who's also here. So what we've done here is try to understand how this ban on imports of fertilizer affected the exports of agricultural products that were more or less reliant on the use of fertilizer. And in the chart here, you can see that about 3/4 after this import ban is introduced, there is a strong decline in the exports of agricultural products. In the next example, coming from Argentina, the policy that was implemented in Argentina was an import license regime. This was in the 2010s, and many products required these licenses to be imported. And the license regime was convoluted, difficult, and introduced a lot of uncertainty. So many firms simply didn't know if they were going to be able to access their foreign inputs for their production, or if they did, they didn't know when they would be able to access them. So naturally, this had costs for the downstream firms. And so in this chart, taken from a paper by Bernini and Garcia Lembergman, they look at the exports of manufacturing firms that use imported inputs subject to this import licensing regime. And what they show, again, is an adverse effect of the import licenses on the exports of those firms. So you see about 1 to 2 years after the regime is in place, the exports of firms dependent on these inputs decline. Finally, the example from Indonesia is based on work that Devaki, along with a few World Bank and IMF co-authors, have been doing. And there, what they wanted to understand is whether the presence of NTMs on inputs played a role for firm resilience to shocks. So the shock that they studied there was an adverse demand shock, which resulted from a depreciation of the Chinese currency. So when the Chinese currency depreciated, Chinese goods became cheaper, more competitive in markets where Indonesian firms were also selling. So for example, in Japan. So suddenly these Indonesian exporters faced a negative demand shock. And while they could also try to take advantage of the Chinese depreciation to import inputs from China more cheaply, because their input imports were in many cases subject to non-tariff measures, they ended up not being able to take advantage of those cheaper inputs, and therefore they suffered larger export declines due to the negative demand shock. So in this chart, you can see that for the firms in Indonesia whose inputs were subject to either import approvals or compliance with domestic standards or some these particular restrictions on port of entry, those firms suffered more, so they saw larger declines in their exports as a result of the negative demand shock. So basically, in this case, NTMs on inputs hurt firms' resilience to shocks. So as we've just seen in these three examples, there are harmful consequences for downstream production and exports from the presence of NTMs on critical imported inputs. But knowing these effects, while useful and relevant, is not enough. We want to go a step further, and we want to try to understand the economy-wide effects of these NTMs on inputs. And in particular, we want to try to understand what happens to incomes and welfare. And to do that, we're going to go into our Sri Lanka example. And to our knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of other work looking at these consequences. So we hope that this is going to be the one first step in trying to understand these effects. So I'm going to move now to give the word to Devaki.
Okay, so just to pick up where Anna left, we were talking about input-output linkages and how the restrictions on import of a critical intermediate input can affect downstream exports. But we are now going to talk about what happens if you think about the effects of restricting imports that goes beyond exports, effects on the domestic economy. The bigger question we are asking today is, what are the aggregate and distributional consequences of a protectionist trade policy, in this case, an import ban on a critical intermediate input, which is fertilizers, for agriculture production, exports, and welfare. Now, fertilizer is a critical intermediate input with a feature that most countries in the world actually use imported fertilizers. Very few countries produce its own fertilizer. Sri Lanka is no exception. Only about 3.5% of the fertilizer requirement inside the country is coming from domestic production. Now, despite the reliance of Sri Lanka on imported chemical fertilizers, the government imposed a ban on the imports of all chemical fertilizers on May 6, 2021. As a consequence of this ban, agricultural production suffered, and there were widespread farmer protests. In the face of these farmer protests, the government was forced to roll back its ban in about 4 months, but by then, agriculture production had already declined because there is a very short window during which fertilizer can be applied to crops, and the ban happened to coincide with that window. Now, while the stated intention of this ban was becoming the first country with fully organic agriculture, the actual purpose was more protectionist as the country was going through a severe balance of payment crisis, and there was this idea that restricting imports can somehow save foreign exchange. However, in our paper, we show that this protectionist import ban actually worsened the trade deficit. It is true that the country saved about $34 million from reduced fertilizer imports coming into the country, but at the same time, the country lost about $398 million worth of agricultural exports. As a result, the country's foreign exchange situation actually worsened, resulting in a trade deficit from agriculture about $364 million. Now, the net agricultural exports depend on a number of things, right? So it's production, it's imports, and it's agricultural imports, it's agricultural exports. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of these components. So we see that the rice yields in Sri Lanka declined by more than 30% after the ban was imposed, and this decline persists if you compare it to any randomly picked year in the pre-ban period. So here we are showing you the plot of annual Maha yield, where Maha is the largest rice growing season in Sri Lanka. In our companion work with our colleagues in remote sensing, we also show that this decline was not driven by any weather-related factors. Now, at the same time that you see this decline in rice yields, Sri Lanka became a country which was mostly self-sufficient in rice production to a country which imported about $40 million worth of rice right after the ban, so which is about a more than 1,000% increase. At the same time, we see that the exports declined more for crops that depend more on fertilizers, such as potato, which saw about 30% decline in export value, compared to groundnuts and onions, which use less fertilizer, which saw about 5% declines in their export values. So for the rest of the talk, we're going to present a novel methodology to study the effects of import restrictions using a quantitative general equilibrium model from which we also derive these numbers. And the idea is to present a general framework which you can use to think about the effects of different types of trade policy restrictions. So first, we're going to start with the supply side of the model, which is basically the agricultural production sector. The key ingredient of the model is what Anna has been emphasizing throughout the talk, which is the input-output linkages, that inputs are critical for imported intermediate inputs are often critical for production and hence exports. In this case, this crucial intermediate input that we're talking about is fertilizer, which Sri Lanka imports from the rest of the world. And this fertilizer is used along with labor and land in agriculture. This labor can move between agriculture and manufacturing. Now, there are different types of crops that are produced, potatoes and rice, which are some of the most fertilizer-intensive crops, to peanuts and onions, which are some of the least fertilizer-intensive crops. The second key ingredient of the model is that there are massive geographical differences in potential crop yields. For example, the central part of the country is very good in producing tea, whereas if you look at, whereas the atmosphere is not that conducive in the northern part of the country for growing tea, which is better in producing rice. And these measures of potential crop yields are obtained from an agronomic model that takes into account geographic factors such as climate and geology from FAO guys. Now, these two key features determine the supply side effects of the fertilizer import ban. As a result of the fertilizer import ban, there is a shortage of fertilizer in the country because Sri Lanka barely produces its own fertilizer. Now, because different regions specialize in producing different crops, and different crops are differentially affected, such as potatoes, which are some of the most fertilizer-intensive crops, are more affected than peanuts, which are some of the less fertilizer-intensive crops, we see that there are regional differences in the fall in agricultural income as a result of the ban. So this is an example. This is showing the map of Sri Lanka and how agricultural income declined across different regions. Two examples are Nuwara area, which is one of the districts of Sri Lanka which has the largest share of potato, which is one of the most fertilizer-intensive crops. And Nuwara area saw one of the largest decline in agricultural income. Another example is Gampaha, which is heavily concentrated in rice, another fertilizer-intensive crops. This district also saw the second largest decline in agricultural income. Now, moving to the demand side of the model, we know that all of us like to eat different types of things. So there are consumers who consume manufacturing and agricultural goods. And among these agricultural goods, you consume potatoes. You also want the cinnamon on your rice pudding. So basically, you have a range of tastes for different things. And these different crops are imported from many different regions of Sri Lanka, as well as the rest of the world. Now, this simple ingredient is very key when we want to think about the welfare effects of the import ban. So if you can very easily give up your plate of rice for that cornmeal, in that case, the negative effect of the fertilizer import ban is going to be much less pronounced because rice is more fertilizer-intensive crop, and it declined more, as we saw before. And second is, if you think about, you can very easily give up your favorite Sri Lankan red rice for that American white rice. You're also going to be less affected by the import ban because rice production in Sri Lanka is suffered as a result of the import ban. So this is a very simple feature, but very key. And the second key demand-side feature of the model is that poorer people spend a larger share of their income on food, a feature pervasive across most countries in the world. Here we are showing you how share of income spent on agriculture varies with log of household income in Sri Lanka. So as our colleagues in DECTI here, Erhan, Bob, and Guido, they have shown that poorer households are susceptible to agricultural shocks because not only they rely on agricultural income, but they also spend a larger share of their budget on food. Now, of course, this feature would not matter if income was very equally distributed. But as we know, this is often not the case. So the third key ingredient of the model is that land, and therefore income, is unequally distributed. Again, a key feature of most developing countries. Here we show you how landholding size is distributed in Sri Lanka. And as you can see, most landowners in Sri Lanka are small landowners owning less than 4 hectares of land, and where there are very few, about 1% of large landowners who own more than 4 hectares of land. Now, these two key features, that poorer people spend a larger share of their income on food and that there is inequality in income, determine the welfare effects of the fertilizer import ban. And we introduced these two features in this class of models. And the main idea is that think about comparing two districts. These two districts have the same exact mean level of income or land, one district has more inequality in income and another district has less inequality in income. So the thought experiment is that as if you're taking income from the hands of the rich people and giving it to the poor people in the more income unequal district. Now, what do we know about the rich people? They spend less on food. So in the district that has more inequality, the size of the agriculture sector is going to be smaller because richer people spend less on food. The size of the manufacturing sector, in turn, is going to be larger. Now, what we know, as a result of the shock, workers can move from agriculture to manufacturing, which means that there is a larger outside option for workers when a negative shock hits the agriculture sector in a district which has a larger manufacturing sector. So this is how these two key features determine welfare. And as we said, in regions where the agricultural employment share is larger, we find that as a result of the fertilizer import ban, the workers suffered more. So there is a negative relationship between the size of the agriculture sectors and how negatively the workers were affected. However, the regions where workers suffer is very different from regions where farmers suffer. For farmers, what really matters is what types of crops they're growing. Are they growing more fertilizer-intensive potatoes or rice or less fertilizer-intensive crops? So here we plot the fertilizer cost share at baseline and see how that relates with farmers' welfare. And we see that in districts where the farmers were growing more fertilizer-intensive crops, such as potatoes and rice, were more negatively affected. And again, these are not the same districts where the workers were more negatively affected. Overall, we see that farmers whose income is more tied to agriculture suffered a much larger welfare loss, about 15% loss in income, compared to workers who suffered much lower, only about 2% of income loss as a result of the ban. Now, because the fertilizer intensity of a district strongly predicts how a farmer loses from the ban, we would expect to see that a district's fertilizer intensity is strongly correlated with GDP loss. And this is what we see here. In panel A, we show how important fertilizer is to the local economy across different districts of Sri Lanka. In panel B, we show you the fall in log income that is predicted by our model. And you can see that in regions where fertilizer is very important are also the regions where income declined much more. When we look at what happened to actual GDP by looking at night lights, we see a very similar pattern, which is what you see in panel C. Now, when you look at this and see that the regions some regions are much worse affected than other regions, a natural question is why don't workers move from the worst affected to the less worse affected regions, and then some of these negative welfare effects become more equal across regions? And in fact, we can show that if you think about a more longer term where workers can move across regions, some of these negative welfare effects are going to be much attenuated, which my other paper and also work by Erhan, Paulo, and Yoon Hee have shown. Now, just to summarize here, what we are basically introducing a general framework with many regions producing crops with different fertilizer intensities, and we have land inequality in the model. And you can think about using this framework to think about different types of trade policy. For example, how would the effects of a quantitative restriction on intermediate imports differ from the effects of a tariff? To think about a specific example, you can also think about how does this global fertilizer crisis affect countries depending on how much fertilizer they're importing. Now, to answer any of these questions or to answer the work we have done, we have to collect and match data from a variety of sources: trade data, national accounts data, price, and satellite data. For example, we have used remote sensing to predict crop production and cultivation area at a granular pixel level. But a major part of our effort was actually about collecting trade policy data. We had to know when and which goods were subject to an import ban and how did it change over time. So we went through gazettes, Sri Lanka's import-export regulations, month by month to identify HS products that were subject to an import ban. And the reason we did this is that to understand the time-varying effect of any trade policy, it is important to collect data on trade policy which varies over time. However, the only global NTM data set, UNCTAD, that Anna was also mentioning, does not include a time dimension for all the products. So we do not know we know from a cross-section how the trade policy, how different types of goods are subject to what types of NTMs, but it does not have a comprehensive time dimension. So the frequent and consistent data collection on NTMs is crucial for us to assess the impact on NTMs. And in fact, there is a lot of work that is going on in different corners with different researchers focusing on specific countries. There is effort led by researchers in Argentina that some of the studies that Anna was mentioning, collecting data on NTMs. And in the World Bank, there is work that is going on to collect comprehensive time-varying data on NTMs in Sri Lanka and work by our colleagues in Indonesia. In fact, this kind of time-varying data collection is crucial for us to understand the economic impact of NTMs over time. And from this work in Indonesia, where they collected data on how non-tariff measures such as import approval and port of entry restrictions change over time, we have seen that these non-tariff measures do not act the same way as tariffs. These non-tariff measures often act as fixed costs, which affects firms' resilience to shocks, as Anna was mentioning from the Indonesian example. In fact, the import approval and port of entry restrictions in Indonesia prevented firms from taking advantage of export opportunities. And throughout the talk, we saw that restrictive policies on imports of critical inputs can be very harmful. It can reduce production, exports, and welfare. And more often than not, these impacts are very unequally distributed across regions and across economic agents. We also saw that this protectionist NTMs on inputs can indeed backfire. If you want, instead of saving foreign exchange by reducing imports, they can increase trade deficit. So then a big and open question is, how can trade policy in this case be leveraged to foster development? What are the different policy options that are available to low and middle income countries? And how do these different policies interact? And we think that there is a lot of research that needs to be done in this area to answer these open questions. And often we want to take the approach of a country-by-country basis or case-specific because these NTMs are so complicated to understand. One example is, again, from Indonesia, where now we're not going to be talking about a restriction on import, but actually a restriction on export. So Indonesia recently put restrictions on exports of some of its critical minerals, for example, nickel. And the idea is that because this nickel is a very critical intermediate upstream input that is used in a number of downstream industries, reducing the exports of nickel will make it more available to domestic industries, thereby fostering the development of more downstream domestic industries that use nickel. And the idea is that Indonesia is going to be able to create more value added at home than exporting the raw nickel. Will this work? Again, at the same time, if you think of reducing export opportunities for an industry, if the industry stays the same in size, then this argument might hold. But as a result of reduced export opportunities, if the industry finds it less profitable to expand, in this case, it's not clear if all these arguments are going to hold. So these are very open questions, and in fact, there's current work that is being done in DECTI in collaboration with our colleagues in Indonesia, and we actually think that these are some of the things we can do in the World Bank, that we can deepen the collaboration between country teams and DEC, where we can work more on these country-specific case studies with rich data collection. As we know that to bridge the gap with research community, these data collection efforts are also very critical because working on collecting data that varies at the time, find time and product level will help us also make the research community interested to study more on the impact of NTMs and their implications for development outcomes. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you. It's very special thanks to everyone who contributed to this policy research talk, without whom this would not have been possible. Daria, Eduardo, Alvaro, Maria, and Paula. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Anna and Devaki. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Mona for some reactions and suggestions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dion, and thanks, Anna and Devaki. That was very, very interesting presentation, and you really went into the details to assess the impact. So clearly you come from the research department of the bank, and I don't come from the research department, so I'm going to give you my perspective more from what's happening on the ground in the countries with whom we are dealing these days, and how they are viewing these topics from more of a kind of reality perspective. And I also want to acknowledge a lot of our current and former DEC colleagues like Aditya, Daniel, Daria. We have been working together for a long time, including on this topic. And actually, when I was in the trade department, we published 3 books on NTMs in 2012. So I guess the problem is only becoming more complex. So my first comment is to put your analysis in the global context of today. I think that it's very important to acknowledge and realize that the world, the trade world, and in the trade environment in which we are operating today is no longer the same that we were operating under, even 4 years ago. We are in an environment where there is geopolitics dictating the trade policies, with calls for friendshoring and so on. There are national security concerns, and there's climate change that's becoming more important, but also entailing more policies and restrictions that are also affecting trade, and I'll say more about it. There are calls sometimes for self-sufficiency in agriculture and key commodities, and there's a weaker WTO. And therefore, I mean, all of this is not going to go away. And I think it took us quite a bit of time for us, trade economists who really have worked on trade trying to move towards globalization, open trade regimes, market access, and for us to start thinking that actually the reality on the ground is no longer like this, and it's driven by developed countries, and with some developing countries following, and other developing countries being actually at a disadvantage because they are ready now to take advantage of trade, and they see these markets closing. I think it took us some time to realize that it seems this reality today is here to stay. And we will benefit greatly from the type of analysis that you're doing if we put it in this context. So I can give examples. We have done some analysis as well on how some types of non-tariff measures are being exploited more these days. For example, subsidies. which can mainly be afforded by developed countries. And today they cover over 50% of the traded products, up from 20% in 2012. Their aim is not to distort, is not really against trade, but they do have an important impact on trade. And the tariff equivalent of these subsidies is greater than the actual tariff. It's 15% in agriculture, 8% in manufacturing. So definitely, we see different types of non-tariff measures rising in ways that are different than we have seen in the past. So we have been seeing NTMs rising, since 2012 when we wrote all these books, and I think Key from DEC was also very much, and Anna, we're very much involved, and this is only worsening and taking slightly different shape. We are also in an area of industrial policy. We don't like to say it, but that's what is happening today. And again, it's driven by developed countries and developing countries. So part of what's happening in terms of addressing climate change issues is a form of industrial policy in developed countries. The CBAM, for example, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, the EU deforestation, the IRA, all of these are really forms of industrial policy for a good cause, which is to fight climate change, but it is affecting trade. It is affecting countries it's affecting developing countries, sometimes positively, a lot of times negatively, and it is affecting certain types of firms in developing countries more than others. So, for example, if you look at mitigation policies of some developed countries, such as the Supply Chain Due Diligence Acts, it really entails that small and medium enterprises that want to be part of a value chain that exports to these markets has to comply with those standards, and they may not be able to comply. Of course, there are also a lot of question marks on, is all of this needed, and is this the best form? But we need to think about that. So in terms of then impact, we're seeing today a trade fragmentation. We're seeing some breaking of some value chains, some countries that are being excluded, some new value chains being developed, such as the value chains of the future for batteries, for solar panels and things like that. But we do need, so I don't think that the export-led growth strategy is gone, but it has definitely changed. And we need to rethink a little bit, what is this new export-led growth strategy in this new context? We need to see, out of all of these NTMs and other policies and industrial policy, and you mentioned that at the very end, who is affected, what sectors are more affected, who is more dependent on others, and which countries are being targeted, and so on. So I think that will help. Now, if I go back to NTMs, it is one tool that is being used as part of this kind of geopolitics, national security, and industrial policy. It's not the only tool, but it's certainly one tool. A reason on the trade front why NTMs are being more used than tariffs is that many countries have bound their tariffs at the WTO, and I mean, no one is really now ashamed of showing that they're more protectionist, because everybody is kind of doing it. But certainly, they still have to follow the WTO rules, and if they bound their tariffs, then that's the non-tariff measures are really the other instrument that they have. And here, I think we need to think about these NTMs if they are going to be used for different purposes, for industrial policy, for national security, for climate, and so on. What is the best way? Because I don't think they will go away. How to maintain transparency? How how to ensure that these measures are being notified to the WTO, how to ensure that they are not discriminatory, that they are least distortive. All of the principles that we were thinking about. It's also important to do some sort of regulatory impact assessment. Again, you mentioned that, what is the justification of the NTM? Some NTMs are justified for a good cause, like, TBTs and so on. And some are justified in the difficult context of today, like for climate change or for self-sufficiency, things that we just need to accept today. So what is the justification? What is the problem or the market failure that they're trying to address? Second, what is the best design? What measures are best to address this particular problem? And then what is the benefit and cost? Who's going to be affected? So you talk a lot about impact, and I think the kind of analysis you're doing on impact of these NTMs is really excellent, because that's what we need to showcase the countries. I don't think we can go to countries anymore today and tell them, don't do this, because they have certain development objectives that entail, again, some type of industrial policy that we're uncomfortable about, but they have their justification. What we can tell them is showcase the impact and see then what is the second best alternative. And I think the kind of analysis that you're doing is extremely important for that. It's also important to look at the impact. I mean, you focused a lot on the domestic impact, on the downstream, on income distribution, maybe different locations and so on. It's important to also focus sometimes on international, impact across borders. And you mentioned, I don't know if you mentioned for example, rice export ban in India. It increased the price of rice globally at the time when it happened. I guess it was after the Ukraine war. You mentioned the nickel export ban in Indonesia, and what I'm hearing is that as a result of that, and I'm having difficulty saying that, but as a result of that, it attracted a lot of investment into Indonesia and exports with value addition action. It was a successful policy, it seems. So I would like, if you can do that analysis, it will be great. But again, I think we need to change a little bit the mindset. You have certainly heard about all these critical minerals that are now, many of them in Africa, some in Latin America and Indonesia. And nobody wants to export these critical minerals in a raw form. And therefore, the first thing that you see in those countries is an export ban. And to tell them that, no, this is not good for you, I think we need to do quite a bit of analysis to showcase that there is no way they can add value, but actually they are really doing their best through industrial policy and trade policies and NTMs to add value. And we need to help them with that, because this is a chance, for example, in Africa to increase value addition from a resource that they have that, now is the time to benefit from it. So I think it's the kind of analysis that you're doing can help better design these kinds of policies. I also want to say that perhaps we need to revise the definition of NTMs. So I mean, we're looking at the UNCTAD definition from I don't know how many years ago now, maybe almost over a decade at least. And we often see national security as a reason to put in place restrictions on trade. And how is that defined? Where does it stop? I think the OECD, for example, started with has a definition that's pretty broad, but maybe we need to really get more into details to understand what does that mean, where does it stop, where does it start. If it's for climate change, there are many NTMs that are put in place that are really a bit outside of the purview of what was in the UNCTAD definition, and rethinking that definition in the context of today will be important. Rethinking the justification of NTMs in the context of today will be important, and assessing the impact, not to say that they're bad, I think but more to inform how best to do certain things, so how best to incorporate these or introduce certain NTMs will be important, because I don't think countries want to listen to just, the old mantra of not undertaking such policies at all. So again, I'm saying some of these things with difficulty, because I think as a trade economist, we don't like to say these things. And but as I tell my colleagues, it seems that the train has left the station, and countries are doing it. Either we better inform them to do better policies, or they're not going to listen to us at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Mona. That was really interesting and helpful to sort of put the broader context as well as the country engagement framing into some of this discussion. So let's open it up, but in case, did either of you have any immediate reactions to some of Mona's comments, or should we just open it up?
Thanking Mona for bringing all these issues together. Let's open.
Okay, so let's open it up. Any questions in the room? Please go to, can I ask you to go to the mic since there is an online audience? They won't hear you otherwise. We have one online that I'll relay, but start with Govinda.
Yeah. Interesting presentation. So you quantified the impact of NTM. That's very good, with examples of Sri Lanka. But I think the impact are more short-term, 1 year or 2 years, something like that. The impact might be different if we see from the longer-term perspective. There are many factors playing for that. For example, one is, even in the short term, there is an exchange rate impact, because the intention of the government might be to save the foreign currency reserve and also to impact the trade balance. So the general economic effect might be trickled down even to the household level, and there might be some impact. The second thing in the longer term is that there is a couple of substitution effect. For example, when there is a import ban on imported chemical fertilizer, then the domestic industry to produce the imported fertilizer might expand. And the second thing also, because the government is planning to have more organic fertilizer, that means the organic fertilizer industry, let us say, might expand. So there is a lot of substitution effect might happen. And also in the longer term, so the government is talking about the organic production. That means the price of the organic product might be more than the price of the normal product. I think considering all these factors, the impact in the longer term might be different than what you have in the short term. Thank you.
Let me just convey one comment in the chat, because it relates to the first part of what Govinda was saying, which is Pakistan faced a serious balance of payments crisis during 2022-23 that necessitated restricting exports. And then the argument that Khurram is making is that this policy paid off in that the current account deficit was brought in from red to green. So similar to what Govinda is saying is, are there circumstances where this actually was a successful policy for that purpose? And then I guess Govinda is asking a bigger question about, is your GE model big enough? Any other comments in the room? Any other questions? Sure, please. And maybe introduce yourself.
Okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Alessandro Baratieri from the East Asia and Pacific Chief Economist Office. Thank you very much. This was very interesting. And I have a short question and a broader maybe point or two. So the short question is about the ban. Can you explain a little bit more the institutional aspects? Because, it's true that long term, but it lasted 4 months. So, and if it's true that the problem the stated was we have a balance of payment problem, why not on everything, right? Precisely because if you only do fertilizers and you don't do rice, so you immediately understand that you have a problem. So I wanted just to understand a little bit more the thing. And in terms of the general agenda, and also respect to what the discussant said, I think it's very interesting to look also dynamics as you are doing in other projects, because effectively we need to have analysis that gives essentially the chance for the objectives stated, right, to materialize, right? So if these policymakers are doing this to make, say, their private sector evolve, we need to have analysis that can tell them, yes, that's happening or not, right? So obviously, we know ex ante that downstream we might have a problem, but the interesting aspect is a downstream problem bigger or lower than what the potential benefits, say, from the sector that are protected, no? So that's one thing. On the current account thing, then there's always the macro side, right? I'm also half macroeconomist, so, you know, savings minus investment is also the net export. So, you know, there is always this thing that, you know, we should also consider.
Thanks. So maybe if you want to react to some of those, and then we'll open it up again if in case there's more.
Okay, so maybe I will. Okay, thank you, Diana. Maybe I will start by responding to some of the questions on Sri Lanka, combining from Govinda and Alessandra. So, yeah, it's a very. Let me give a little bit of the institutional background because I think that helps some of the discussion. So, the ban was actually not just on fertilizer; it was part of a bigger ban, and in fact, some of the documents that we read from the government, it said that they're trying to impose ban on some of the more final products rather than intermediate inputs. So, but clearly the ban did not adhere to all those things that it says. In many cases, it ended up restricting critical intermediate inputs such as fertilizer. But we are also doing an ongoing work on the broader impact of the ban on different types of product. And on the dynamics, yes. So yeah, it's in an ideal world, it's possible that some of the substitution actually goes towards organic fertilizer, then organic agriculture, and it's great and it benefits. So, but the major problem that we understand by talking with people who are like agricultural experts and also experts in organic fertilizer is that a lot of the transition has to be like a bundle of inputs. So if it's a ban, then the farmers most often do not know how to transition to organic agriculture because there needs to be some education and some other bundle of inputs that go with organic transition, inorganic to organic. So I think in the case of Sri Lanka, those were completely absent. It was a ban, and then there was the size of the domestic industry was also very, very small for fertilizers. So there was, in the short run, of course, there was nothing. But in the long run, if you think about even a transition, one of those big success stories is actually a state in India, Sikkim, that actually did an organic transition from inorganic. But there was no ban involved. There was like year by year, gradual transition, a lot of information given to farmers. So we have seen that some of these success stories can happen. But more often than not, with a ban, without any more bundle of support, it's very difficult for farmers. And the other point was about the price of organic. So it is also true that we have seen that goods that have the organic label earn more. But there is also like recent work by Lucas Zavala and other co-authors who actually show that to even get these organic stickers, it takes many, many months and lots of hurdles. So first you have to like be you have to establish your reputation. So it's a huge transition cost, even after you have transitioned to organic. So that's on the other point. Did you want to add anything? Maybe on
just I think is this working? So just on I think on Sri Lanka, I think we covered. I mean, I guess in contrast to the example that's coming from the online comment, where in Pakistan it paid off, I think in Sri Lanka it did not pay off, at least in terms of the trade balance in agriculture. It definitely, this ban did not help to resolve the problem. Just on Alessandro's question on, or comment on dynamics, I guess what you mean is that we do need to do more studies where, right? So I think it's a call for more work where we take into account, we let, the short run become the medium or the long run. And so we can really see if these policies are benefiting some industries, maybe hurting others. So yes, very much we are all here to try to think about where, what research to do that's going to be useful. So yeah, the dynamics is going to be an important part.
Can I just pick up on one aspect of that, which is, I mean, coming through the narrative, both from you and from you, is, countries are arguing that there are these benefits out there for imposing these kinds of policies. And I guess what Mona was arguing, and implicit in what you're saying, and is that there are some benefits. There are some real benefits, and caricaturing trade economists saying, "Oh, any of these things is bad, bad, bad." So I guess the question is there scope within this analysis to sort of really look at both the benefits and the costs and sort of have some nuanced story about that we can go to a government and sort of say, well, you may be gaining this, but really here's the price you're paying, and that then you're putting them at their feet. That's sort of a choice at their feet. I'm curious as to whether that's where you want to go with this kind of analysis, or just you had any thoughts on that as an approach? Because really, it seemed like what you were doing here was really, I mean, I thought it was fascinating, frankly, as a microeconomist, to trace these policies all the way down, and all of a sudden we're talking about farmers and incomes. I mean, to me, that was really fascinating. But it was very much on the negative side, and I guess I'm curious, is there somebody gaining in here somewhere? And that it could be at the macro level, but it also could be at the micro level. Question, I don't know.
I think definitely, I mean, this particular policy in Sri Lanka had, mostly adverse effects, but there are many others, many other NTMs that can have beneficial effects. I think, Mona mentioned some of the potential examples from restricting exports of certain products that they may be having positive effects. I mean, this is very much happening, so we still need to learn more. But for example, some of the work, the very first chart I showed from work with Tristan and Lucas, we are looking at NTMs of this regulatory type, so these that are imposed to protect health and safety. And for that group, at least for the Latin American countries, we actually find that these measures are actually helping increase trade for some of those countries, because they're serving as a sort of a quality assurance mechanism. And by imposing the measures, there's some sort of reallocation of more trade. So that's an example, but I think that's the direction we should go into.
I want to quickly add to that also on the Indonesia example that we were talking, Mona, about, as that we are actually right now we are working on with colleagues in Indonesia on actually understanding exactly the steps where nickel is going into a lot of downstream industries, and are these downstream industries growing? So we are very much we don't know the answer to any of these questions yet, and I think this is also connecting to your question, Dion, that in fact this is something which can be a positive effect of, I mean, kind of looking at if this intermediate input restricting it is actually helping the downstream industries. And there's more work actually, like there's some work by that looks at how this how NTMs create costs of entry, so that only more reputable firms or firms who are selling products of higher quality are actually able to sustain and enter in the market. And so that's work by Ariel Weinberger and his co-authors, and so that's another example. And I think more generally what we see is that this Sri Lanka example it's really an extreme example where we're thinking of a critical intermediate input, and it's kind of hard to come up with how this can actually have a positive impact. Maybe there are some things that we are missing, but the idea is more about how critical this input is in the whole process that we're talking about.
So just to add that, I don't think NTMs are there are the only solution. If you think that NTMs can be part of the solution, and I would be very much interested to see your study on nickel in Indonesia, because I mean what I'm hearing is I guess, what people are observing with no real evidence. So it would be great to see. But what are the complementary policies then that need to be put in place to ensure that, if the goal is to develop value addition in nickel and attract investment, it's not just about putting in place an export ban. There should be other policies and regulatory reforms that are put in place. Second, I want to say that there are new issues that are arising today at the global level. That are not necessarily economic, like national security. The need to address climate change, and then how do you do it in an efficient way? The geopolitics, the fact that key critical inputs and critical products at a global level are heavily concentrated in very few countries. And that's also why these NTMs and subsidies and so on are emerging in other countries. So there are non-economic and economic issues at a global level that are really driving this new wave of NTMs as well. Thank you.
So let's open it up again. Please come to the mic. We have three hands right now, so maybe just line up if you don't mind. Okay. Take all three. And then
maybe just a question for Mona. So far we have been really discussing about a lot of what unilaterally these countries can do. So where do we stand with the multilateral global trading system? Is something that we should put on the side for now, or should we look at this, and should we look at the interaction between multilateral liberalization or some kind of cooperative agreement and the unilateral policies? Thanks.
Just 0.5 questions and 0.5 comments. So I really like the fact that you are doing external validation, because in these type of models, it's usually very difficult to validate the model. And then you did a great job, and I don't think I remember it from your previous presentations, the nightlight data and the correlation. And if I interpreted the colors correctly, there's a very strong correlation between the shock, how it is negatively affecting different regions, and the changes in the economic activity, very strong correlation, right? So if there were, and this is half of the comment and then the half question, if there were some benefits and the benefits were actually strong relative to these costs, we would not see this to be true, right? The correlation. The benefits, I think, are probably very minor and negligible, so that we are seeing this. So is this a correct interpretation, or you think it will change in the long run? Thank you.
And we have two more. Let's go here and then there, and then we'll do a last round. I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you so much, Xiao from South Asia Chief Economist Office, and congratulations to do such a great job to illustrate how the import ban can impact export through such a detailed analysis. And so the one additional comment to the import ban is that probably I'm thinking the impacts on export does not only come from the agricultural supply chain itself. It can also come from other sectors even without linkages. Like for example, in once you have certain bans in certain industry, we also probably can consider the factors of domestic resources flow, because it artificially increases the price of one particular sector. That means the relative profit in that sector is higher than in other sectors. Then the domestic resources will flow into the protected sectors, which can prevent the export diversification from happening. So that can hurt the competitiveness of export in other sectors too. So the export impact not only come from the agriculture supply chain, but also others. This is a very obvious example in our region, like in Bangladesh. For example, the government want to put tariffs on final products, but it attracts a lot of domestic resources into that industry and really discourage export in many, many other sectors. Yeah, so that's the one issue here. Thank you.
Thanks. Last question.
My name is Salma Emmanuel. I'm a Robert McNamara Fellow with DIME. Thank you for the good presentation. I was just wondering, it would be interesting to observe some of the other actors along the value chain. I'm not sure if you were able to observe like some of the traders who traded fertilizers and how they would also be affected rather than just the farmers. Thank you.
Thanks. So let's start with Anand Devaki, and then, like I said, I'll give the final word to Mona, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, so let me start in order with Erhan's question. So your memory is super sharp. We did not have the nightlights in the previous version. It's very new, and we think about the nightlights as more like a validation that actually we are seeing this very strong correlation, and the model numbers are also matching what we actually see, what is implied by the nightlights, and whether it means that the benefits are less than the costs, maybe I'm not entirely sure, but maybe we can discuss this. But to me, it seems more like a validation. But I'm going to be very excited to see if you have any different interpretation on this. And just to answer the question on I think this question is on your question on the resources flowing into the sector that is being protected is very related to like the long run dynamic impacts. And I think in this situation, the fertilizer industry was almost non-existent. And so an interesting maybe future work will be to actually see whether it helped expand the domestic fertilizer industry. And that's something I think will be a nice follow-up future work.
The last comment on us considering the intermediaries, and yes, that's something we're right now working on, adding more texture to the fertilizer, let's say, distribution and in the model. So we don't have data on it, but we're going to try to incorporate some features.
Thank you. Mona, last reactions.
Thank you, Dion. So I'll answer Daria's difficult question. I mean, we are certainly supportive of the multilateral rules-based trading system. I think it's very important for trade, even when we are living in an era of maybe more protectionism and all these issues of national security and climate change and the fragmentation happening. We still need a body like the WTO, and it serves the interests of everybody, including developing countries. So I think it's very important that we support that. You talked about these cooperation agreements that are now popping up. So they're not very transparent. Some of them, and they don't follow any rules. And they're not really free trade agreements. So free trade agreements are defined by the WTO in a certain way. They have to have include substantially all trade and so on. And these cooperation agreements, I saw some between the EU and the African countries that have critical minerals, or the US and African countries that have critical minerals, or others that are maybe driven by certain political objectives with that are justified, such as reducing reliance on certain countries or diversifying the source of where they import critical products such as batteries and so on. So, but they're not very transparent, and we don't know really what these MOUs are, what the developed countries, which are involved in the MOUs usually, are providing as incentives to these countries. So the US has some of these MOUs with Latin America or some Latin American countries, but they also give them subsidies and support. And therefore, the level playing field is becoming a little bit less obvious and more murky. If we're going to move into this, I think it will be good that, again, we have some rules on transparency and on design that are overseen by a body like the WTO. Having said that, there are new things that also we need to look into that perhaps we didn't do before. For example, standards and harmonization of carbon pricing. If this is going to start popping up, you know, who's going to oversee that? Should every country have its own carbon pricing? How is it going to affect trade? So, so there are many issues that require, again, some harmonization, some oversight. Who should do it? We need to think about it. But again, I see that the multilateral system is you know, being stretched right now, but I think we need to support it more instead of less. And I just want to end by saying, you know, the kind of analysis that you are doing is extremely useful, because this is the time when these issues are arising, these policies are being put in place, and if we don't look at their impact, I think, you know, we will not be able to advise our countries properly.
Thanks, Mona. I was going to try to say something like that, but you said it better than I could have. But I thought it was fascinating, and you know, great pair of presentations. And like all good research, you know, there's asking for more, and for more in the big picture, for more in the small picture, for more on the lateral picture, the context. So I really appreciate the presentation, and I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you, Mona. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Devaki. And thank you all for coming. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.